as advertised, we're going to have a presentation on VR Post. We have Edward Dawson-Taylor of Edge Visuals. And Edward comes from a highly creative background, both technically and artistically. He was a photographer, a musician before segueing into software development and becoming a professional VFX artist. In CGI, he's worked in many areas through commercials and interactive and feature films. And he is the CEO of Edge Visual. I believe you worked with your wife on that too.
Yeah.
So Edward, tell us what we don't know about VR, which is everything.
Yeah. I mean, we're all trying to figure it out. So I will tell you what I know. I'm going to talk for a little bit about virtual reality, particularly as it relates to post-production, which is a lot of where I come from. As the great introduction said, thank you for that. I have come through a number of different careers through software engineering and animation into now virtual reality. And I do spend quite a lot of my time, not all my time working on VR, but it's becoming more of a conversation. So VR it's kind of an umbrella for a lot of things. A lot of people talk about VR these days as being what is 360 video, or it could be a game experience. Essentially, everyone's using it as a term to describe an immersive format, albeit that in a number of different formats and platforms and pieces of hardware. So when people talk about VR, they could be talking about any number of different things. I'm going to talk probably mostly about 360, particularly for this audience. So 360 video is what a lot of people are calling VR, and that's basically capturing your environment and playing you a film that you're essentially a part of that film. You're inside it, looking out. So the format that most people are using these days is 360 mono, although stereo is possible. Stereo 360 is kind of the holy grail of VR. And VR is kind of like the Wild West of filmmaking at the moment. It really is figuring itself out. There's no definite rules. There's a lot of hardware and a lot of software coming onto the market, but it's all extremely new and it's very experimental. There are people making films in VR and as well as interactive experiences. I have personally worked on some 360 video, some 360 post, and also some interactive experiences. So yeah, VR in mono is kind of what everybody's doing. It's essentially just because stereo is much, much harder, an order of magnitude harder. There are cameras out there that do it, but the problems associated with it is just a lot harder. So people are tending more towards 360. So yeah, I have a slide up here that says, why create in VR? It's a good question. I don't know. Why create in VR? I think VR allows you the opportunity to immerse the viewer a lot more, and it can create a much more inclusive feel with your viewer and promote more of an emotional response, actually being inside the film. That said, it's not necessary to create everything in VR, and I think at the moment a lot of people are creating VR because it's cool, and that's fine. It's great. I mean, people are experimenting with it and trying to push the medium. But I personally believe that if you're going to make something in VR, then think about all the things think about all the reasons you would make a film. Think about why are you making that film. In general, people are making a film to tell a story. You can tell a story with a rectangular format that everyone's used to seeing, and going and seeing a film in that way. In that way, it's a lot easier to create the angles and for the director to shepherd you through the experience. In VR, you can essentially look anywhere. So you are working with the director after the film's been made to create the experience. So I think why make VR? In answer to that question, it's if you want your user to be a part, or if you want your consumer to be a part of the movie, if you want them to be essentially a character in the movie, because that's kind of what you become when you're watching a VR experience. You become a character in that movie, and I think a lot of the challenges with making VR content come from not having thought properly about why are you there, why are you in that experience. If you're watching a movie, you can be third person, first person. Doesn't really matter. You don't have to explain it. In VR, all of a sudden you have to explain why is the person there, who are they, what's happened to them, what's brought them there. So it's kind of a different process. I put some tiny graphics up there for you, really tiny. I can't even read them. I'm right next to it. But anyway, this is just to illustrate everyone's getting into VR. That's basically what that means, and no one really knows what to do with it exactly. So in a sense, it still follows the same procedure, the same pipeline. You still have the concept of pre-production, production, and post-production. So stepping into pre-production, I personally believe that there's more or just different planning that you need when you're creating something in virtual reality. As I was saying, the story, from the story perspective, you have to think about why is the person there, because when you capture with the camera in VR, that usually, I haven't seen anything where you don't feel like you are a character in the experience. And for that reason, you have to consider that in a storytelling sense. Like, why have you got there? What are you doing there? What are you supposed to do there? So also when you're on the shoot, there's a lot more planning that goes into building out the thing which you're shooting. In a traditional shoot, you would go off, you would build to an angle, and you would make that look great. And behind the camera, just anything, no matter, doesn't matter what's behind the camera. You can have elephants and zebras, and it doesn't matter. But in VR, everything is seen, and it's a little bit more like building a theater or building a theme park or something where you're inside the experience. You have to think about every single angle that you could possibly look at. You can't have a camera crew in the way. Well, there are ways to do that, but in general, you want to clear the entire set. Otherwise, it involves tons of post, which I will get into in a bit. Anyway, it's just more thinking, more preparing. It's a little bit more like building a world, which I actually did for Jungle Book. I worked on the pre-production for Jungle Book. And we actually used VR in pre-production to design the world. And we built essentially a real-time previs in a game engine, which then you could go inside and you could explore. And actually, Jon Favreau did that. He used VR goggles and went inside the world and was looking around in the jungle with the DP, with Bill Pope, and they were both kind of checking it out and looking for good angles, which, we built a world and he was checking it out and seeing where would look good inside that world, which is very different than traditional storytelling where you would work an angle, you would draw it, and then you would dress it and shoot it. And with VR, it's a little more exploratory. That said, in the design process, you can still have a main direction. You can still have like a primary direction where the action's happening, and everything else that's happening might not be quite as filled out or well designed, or it's still got to look good, but it doesn't have to be as rich and full as everywhere. There's also other things such as designing your shots. The shots tend to be longer because you can't do fast cuts and moves and stuff like that. They just don't work quite as well in VR. Choosing cameras. There's tons of cameras coming onto the market. Ranging. Also, another important consideration beforehand is the budget, because when you're using one camera, it can be expensive. If you use a really fancy camera, if you're using 6 or 15 of them, all of a sudden it can be prohibitive. There are a range of different options, going from a tiny little one with 2 cameras, doesn't get you particularly great resolution. I have it in my bag. All the way up to multiple red rigs, which just gets more expensive. And there are other considerations for different cameras, such as what are you going to do with the footage afterwards? There's the whole rest of the pipeline you've got to think about up front. How much data are you going to create? We were talking about editing earlier on, and dealing with lots of film, or dealing with lots of the hard drives. This just goes up and up. If you're using 6 cameras, imagine ingesting all of that footage. And some of the cameras work more nicely than others. Blackmagic, I know, is a little more friendly in terms of ingestion than Red can be, although Red is obviously lovely. Blackmagic's kind of becoming the industry preferred route because of the cost. It's much cheaper and it's easier to deal with. But then there's like tons of GoPro options as well. Lots of affordable options if you need them. So cameras in production, it's really just about all the things I've already said. Just being organized, designing it well up front, just making sure that you know what all the challenges are, speaking to the right people, and making sure that you're thinking about every part of it from the perspective of shooting in every direction, and making sure that you can handle what you've got afterwards, which moves into post-production. And post-production in VR there's a lot of similarities to post-production in not VR, whatever that's called now. We're going to have to come up with a new term for that. So post-production can mean a lot of things as well. It can mean anything from coloring to shoving dinosaurs on top of the footage which you shot to so there's so many different things that post can mean. And within VR, it's just you're essentially just dealing with more of it. There are some specifics to it as well, such as the format which you're producing at the end. You're still producing a rectangle at the end, but it's a little bit like this icon in the bottom right corner. It's warped and stretched, and it's called lat long, and it has another few names. But basically, you then wrap that around your perspective, and then you can look anywhere inside that, and it will give you any perspective from that point. So to produce that, you're taking a multi-camera rig and you're stitching that all those pieces of footage back into this deliverable, and that's a process. That's a new process. That's now a whole new job in post-production. It's tending to be done by compositors because one of the best tools that's emerging to be able to stitch all of that stuff back together again is in Nuke, and it's called Cara. There's other stitch solutions to be able to get all of this footage together into one format. Some cheaper ones, such as Color and Video Stitch, which I've used, are good, but they just don't have as much flexibility. And especially if you have to add extra stuff into the footage, if you have to add CG into the footage, you're then dealing with a whole extra layer on top of that. And Nuke gives you more flexibility. So Cara is becoming preferred, although it's just V1, and like everything else in VR, it's being figured out, and but it's usable, and it does a good job. In terms of editing, that can be pretty similar. You can edit together in a similar way than you would edit normal stuff together. Premiere is becoming the preferred VR solution because it has a few extra bits and pieces in it, but essentially you should be able to edit with most standard editing tools. As far as stitching and post goes, it's generally Cara, After Effects, Skybox. You can use both of those for adding extra special effects on top. Which, when it comes to that, it's kind of It's relatively similar, although there's some different parts to the process. When you're rotoscoping and like cutting things out of footage and sticking them back over the top of CG, you normally do that in one rectangle. If you have 6 or more cameras, you have to do all of your roto on the original. Thought it's better to do all your roto on the original plates than it is to produce this end result and then roto it. And the main reason for that is because the stitch solution is a whole new process. It's sometimes desirable to go back and change that. So if you've rotoed things which are in your end deliverable and you go change the stitch, then suddenly they're in a different place. So it's better to roto and paint everything out in the plate in the original footage. And then when you create your CG, you use a camera that renders that from Maya or 3D Studio or whatever your weapon of choice is for CG. It will render you that format, and then you can crudely explaining it, you can kind of stick the two together, and you can render your roto back through your stitch to give you the right roto for this, so you can then work with a familiar process if you're in that part of the game. There's differences to how things used to work, such as like blurs. If you imagine blurring something, you're blurring a region of pixels that's local to a position. In these formats, everything at the bottom edge, the very bottom edge of this format, that entire row of pixels is actually one pixel in the sphere. So if you blur across there, it's not the same as if you blur in the middle. It treats it differently, but things like Skybox or Kara, they will break that into a cube, and you can essentially use similar post-production effects in that format as opposed to this final deliverable. But when you're talking about stereo, people nowadays are tending towards doing stereo conversion as opposed to shooting in stereo, just because it's tons more footage, it's more complicated. You also get some strange artifacts with doing multiple stitches if you have different stitches for each eye, and the stitch works out differently in each eye, that can produce strange effects. So people are tending to more towards stereo conversion. I'm sensing I'm running out of time.
I have to apologize. We'll have to have you back for a complete session that's all about this subject, because it's a lot more than I thought.
Right.
But fantastic, very interesting, and we thank you very much, Edward.
Pleasure.